but I will say that, part of my book, what book is that? Why, that's A Marvelous Life, the
Yeah.
amazing story of Stan Lee. Available, not only is it available in hardcover, the paperback is coming out September 1st, and there's an audio book that I myself read.
Oh,
So
wow.
if you think hearing this is great, just wait till you get the audio book.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Comics Cube, and today I am with Mr. Danny Fingeroth. Hi, Danny.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you today?
Okay, my hair is funny today. My makeup and costume crew were had the day off, so unfortunately my hair is not behaving. But otherwise, I'm doing as well as can be expected in our current crazy world. How are you?
I'm good. I try to keep my hair down too, but then it just keeps on flying away. So we've got the same issue.
Well, you got the headphones on. I should have worn mine.
Well, I got to wear my headphones for sound quality. So,
That's true. Yeah.
I first got introduced to you because I was collecting Spider-Man in the late 80s and early 90s.
Uh-huh.
And that was really like sometime in the early 90s is when I started really paying attention to the credits. And you were the editor back then.
I was the editor. I was the group editor because the Spider-Man line had like 17 monthly titles. So I was the head of that department. And then there were several other editors who worked under me or with me, however you want to phrase it.
There were so many titles. How did you manage to handle that?
We had a lot of meetings and a lot of charts. We had some spreadsheets. Since this was like the prehistoric days of computers, we would just like draw charts or write memos and, just the constant coordinating between the editors and the writers and the artists. And, it would become very crucial in big crossover stories like Maximum Carnage and stuff like that. So it was, that was a challenge, but it was fun too. But I just tried to surround myself with smart people and who were able to keep track of that stuff. And when everybody was, loved, obviously you're working in that business, you love comics, and Spider-Man, is a character that people enjoy. So it was, it was stressful, but it wasn't impossible to keep track of.
Do you remember when you started on the Spider-Man books?
On the Spider-Man books?
Yeah.
Well, I actually had two different phases of the Spider-Man books.
Mm-hmm.
I was the editor. I was promoted to editor in the early 80s. You remember the early 80s, right?
Well, I was born in the early 80s. So,
okay, well, there you go.
So my answer is no.
Around the time you were born, I was promoted. That was when around the Secret Wars period, when Tom DeFalco took over as writer and Ron Frenz took over as artist. So I was also there for part of Roger Stern and John Romita Jr. And I did that. So that was when I first became I guess it's best known as the introduction of the alien costume, the black suit.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my first time around. Then I'd been at Marvel since '77. I don't know if you want to go that far into prehistory. But I then went freelance for several years, and then I gave, and part of that was giving up the Spider-Man books, and I figured, well, I'll never see those again. I mean, it wasn't even a matter of prestige or lack thereof, or I mean, at that point, editorial royalties had kicked in, so editors were in for a piece of the a tiny piece of the sales of the comics. So I thought, well, I will never see those books again. I'm taking a risk going freelance, but I want to follow my heart. And then for numerous reasons, I came back in '89, and by late '90, for a variety of reasons, I got the Spider-Man books back. And so that was sort of my second time around. And it was interesting. The company had changed, the business had changed. We were in the middle of the that big boom of the late 80s, early 90s. And, so it was interesting. I mean, I'd done some writing of Spider-Man. I wrote Web of Spider-Man for a while. I wrote 2 miniseries, Deadly Foes and Lethal Foes of Spider-Man. So I've been doing a lot of writing, and a lot of that involved Spider-Man. But it was a different era in the company and in the comic industry in general. As a fan, you probably know. Yeah. Although, when did you start reading them? In the early 90s, you said.
It's hard to say when I started reading them because I have an older brother who
Okay.
who was buying comics. So I I remember my first few Spider-Man comics had like Spider-Man in the black costume, Spider-Man not married to Mary Jane, and
Uh-huh.
Spider-Man in the red costume married to Mary Jane because he was just buying back issues. And
Right.
I didn't even think there was a continuity because I just thought these were all different stories happening all at once. Kind of like how there are
Right.
different
Well, that.
cartoons. Yeah, so
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
That
what I
makes.
thought.
Yeah, and the art. I get the art was similar enough. It's not like you could say this is 60s styles, this is 70s styles. Right. That I could see how. So was that confusing or was that exciting to you?
That was exciting to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Because
what? Yeah, absolutely.
go on. I mean, I know it's an interview with me, but I'm curious. What was exciting about
No, it was just like there's so much Spider-Man.
it?
Why am I going to complain? So when people complain about things like how different versions of this character like don't make sense, I'm like, I don't get it. But
Now, I think that's kind of what makes, I don't know about it, a true, someone who really loves comics and loves those characters. There was always, to this day, it's the balance. It's like, if we have to do constant new issue number ones because we don't want people to feel they're coming in the middle of something complicated. But there's a lot of people who enjoy coming in the middle of something complicated and figuring it out. I mean, that I guess when the whole collectors thing and slamming things and became a big thing, an issue number one was important. But when I was a kid, the logic was the opposite. It's like, wow, there's 300 issues of Action Comics. I can't wait to somehow find out what those others were. Plus, if it lasted 300 issues, people must like it. It must be good.
do you think that's got something to do with just the way media is consumed now? Because even with TV back then, you very, very rarely started from the beginning. And now you're
Right.
like, if you're going to start with something like Game of Thrones, people just want to start from the very beginning.
Well, I mean, it's funny. Even in the 70s and 80s when I started, the comics were consumed, whether by kids or by adults, wherever they bought them. The idea was, the philosophy we had was any comic, even if it is issue 400 or whatever, is not only somebody's first issue of that comic, but maybe even the first comic book somebody ever even read.
In
So
their
I mean,
life. Yeah.
that's a little extreme, but it's certainly say. So that's why you would see for a while, say anytime, the first, people would say things like, "I, the Thing, have the strength of 1,000 men." Hopefully the idea was you'd say it more subtly but that's why you would see every issue people introducing themselves or somebody somehow or other, whether it be in a caption or dialogue or a footnote, because the idea was while it was good that this was a tried and true property that had been around for a long time, um, it was equally true that you wanted to give somebody a fighting chance of understanding the story once they were, once they had made the commitment to spend their 15 cents and buy the comic.
And you definitely instituted that practice with all of your writers back then.
Well, I
So,
mean, it came from certainly when Jim Shooter was the editor in chief.
mhm.
It just, it wasn't just a thing that suddenly appeared. There were meetings and memos and discussions. I mean, and the idea was yes, we might bore or alienate a long-time reader by having a recap, or even recapping the character's powers at the beginning of every issue. But don't forget, this was especially in the era before the collected editions.
Hmm.
Then even if it was repeated, you hadn't seen an issue of the comic since a month before.
That's
So
true.
yeah, so I mean, I certainly carried out that policy, and I agreed with that policy. I thought it was a good idea, but it was a different, the idea of a story being a chapter in an arc I mean, I guess that's been around for 25 or 30 years now, but in comics history, that's a relatively new thing. The idea that you were writing a story that was not a complete story, but
Hmm.
was a part of a continued storyline. Because we always felt, even when that came in, we still felt an obligation to have in each issue what we called a complete unit of entertainment. In other words, you bought one comic, and even if it was part of a larger 5 or 10 part storyline, something should happen in page 1 to page 22. Something should progress. Some new thing you never saw. Some subplot should advance or be resolved, and then hook on to another subplot. We certainly wanted readers to be addicted and love the comics and come back month after month, but we felt that that there was a responsibility to resolve something and start something else and pay off on something along the way.
That's really interesting because I've been rereading, or in some cases just reading, every issue of Spider-Man from the very beginning, and I think I'm at around 1977 right now.
Wow.
And the recaps every issue can get kind of rough when you're reading it in a binge. But you're right. I'd completely forgotten that if you haven't seen it in a whole month, I do
Right.
need a recap of what happened last month.
Or if you're a kid or an adult who just buys an issue now
Yeah.
and then, maybe you're not buying, even if you want to. A lot of times in comics history, I mean, like now, there have been distribution issues. Those are always the crisis points in comics history. If you look back through your comics history, and you probably
Hmm.
have, I mean, things happen. Readers' tastes change or whatever, but very often the thing that precipitates a crisis is when somebody gets cued with distribution. So there was a lot of time, and I would, I don't know how distribution is. I would guess in the Philippines, you don't get every, certainly on the newsstands.
Oh, there are no newsstand comics. No,
Newsstands, right? So
it's
there's
all
only
through the
comic
comic
shops.
shops. Yeah.
Okay, well then I guess you don't have that issue. But in an era when there were newsstands, um, then you might not get every issue, or you might get 3 issues of the same comic coming out in 1 week, or so you always had a figure. That was the big risk that Marvel took in the '60s. Actually, was doing continued stories
Hmm.
because distribution was so spotty. It was risky to, that's why DC, you'd buy a DC comic, and it would be, not only would it be all done in 1 issue, but you'd often have 3 stories an issue of Action Comics or Superman comics. So this was a big risk, and all the more reason why you need to recap, every issue. But so again, you don't want to alienate somebody who's read every issue and bore them, but you also want to give somebody a chance who is just picking it up, um, you know, by chance.
But at the same time, in the 60s, if you had a choice between a full DC comic book or a not an incomplete Marvel comic drawn by Kirby or Ditko, like
Well,
I think I
I
know
would.
which one I'm picking.
Me
But
too. But I hear there are DC fans out there. I mean, since one of the things I'm here to do is to plug my books, such as my new biography of Stan Lee, A Marvelous Life. But I've written other books, and we will talk about, I'm sure, about the Stan bio. But I wrote a book called Superman on the Couch: What
Yeah.
Superheroes Really Tell Us About Ourselves and Our Society. And part of that book is I sort of, I'm not a psychologist, but I play one on TV. So I kind of do like kind of a a sociology or Psych 101 kind of evaluation of who would be a Marvel fan as opposed to who would be a DC fan traditionally. And I mean, I certainly, in my career as a comics pro and just as a comics reader and fan before that, you meet people who would say, well, I only read Archie comics, right? But then you'd meet people who say, oh, I never cared for those Marvel comics. I like the DC comics. And so this, I don't know if there's any one, hard and fast rule about who likes which comics, but yes, I think the reason we're talking and the reason that you are embarked on a mission of reading every Spider-Man comic is because there's something about that character, and there's something about Marvel, right? There's something about Marvel that after 1960, that after 60 years, still after 60 years and a dozen corporate changes of hands in both Marvel and DC, we can sit here and go, oh yeah, those Marvel comics has something that those DCs don't, or those DCs has something those Marvels don't. That's a pretty rich and deep kind of a storytelling cultural divide. I mean, I find it fascinating, which is why I wrote a book partly about that. Right?
Do you so what would the main thing differentiating a Marvel fan and a DC fan? Because I love them both, but
yeah.
there's just something about Marvel where I can read a whole run.
But it goes, oddly enough, and again, not just to plug my book, but I think it goes back to Stan, and Jack and Steve, but I think a lot of it has to be, and I'm sure people watching this some will disagree passionately and some will agree passionately. I think it goes down to Stan Lee, and that has nothing to do with who got paid what, who got credit for what. That's complicated. That's why I wrote a book about it, But that personality, where that person, whoever that fictional version of Stan Lee was that we were seeing and reading when I was a kid in the 60s, and somehow that was handed down to everybody who has written and edited and drawn those Marvel comics and made those Marvel movies. That's a powerful thing. There's no law about it. There's no written, handbook at the company, but something about the relationship that Stan established with the readers, and whatever that version of Stan Lee that we knew and related to, that he embodied that company. I mean, it really, so of course, obviously he could not have done it without Kirby and Ditko and Larry Lieber and John Romita. It's a collaborative art form. Kirby and Ditko especially were geniuses and great storytellers and did do a lot of the plotting, but there's something about Stan Lee's personality, or that aspect of Stan Lee's personality, that he invented or focused and showed us. I think that's, and I think maybe people who don't like Marvel or who like DC more, or, I mean, and of course, I've heard there are other comics besides Marvel and DC in the world too. But, people who don't respond to that probably don't like, even if they don't know it, don't like that part of Stan Lee's personality that he put out there in the 60s. I think it really, and it's funny because I think something happens when even somebody who was an editor or a writer or artist at DC comes to Marvel, or vice versa. Somehow, as much as for a long period, DC tried to imitate Marvel, in the 70s, in the 70s and 80s, especially. I just think that there's something about, I know it's sounding all kind of mystical about it, something it's like a money-making publishing enterprise, but there's something about just being under the Marvel umbrella, again, no matter what corporation or what nameless, faceless business entity owns it, that somehow Stan's voice and personality comes through after all these decades.
there is a reason that out of the three of them, because I know there's other guys, but like I think it was kind of built on the three of them.
Right.
That we associated with Stan. His personality is just the most
Yeah. Well,
media friendly.
media friendly, and Kirby and Ditko were, Kirby and Ditko were more introverted, I believe. And face it, Stan was in the office, so somebody called and said, "I want, from a newspaper or radio or TV or movie or somebody. I want to do a story on Marvel Comics. I want to talk to somebody." Well, that's Stan. He made himself available, and again, whether that, for Jack Kirby to come in for a day to be interviewed by a reporter means it's a day that Jack, who was strictly a freelancer, is not making money. So that was part of it too. But yes, Stan did have a personality that was born. Well, that was partly born and partly constructed. I think he responded to it well, but he was very good at sensing how important media would be to him personally, to Marvel as a brand, to the stories. I'm not saying he planned the whole thing out, because nobody could foresee this, this unbelievable phenomenon that Marvel has become. But he certainly was willing and able to be the voice and face, of Marvel. And then it ended up being really most people, when you ask them, people who are not comics fans or regular readers, when you ask them to name one comic book creator, Stan, and then that's pretty, that's, who else does anybody know? Maybe Todd McFarlane, because Todd has been smart enough to get himself known in other areas.
Yeah, for my generation, it's Todd and Jim Lee.
Jim Lee, that's interesting, because Jim is the face of DC Comics. Is that?
I think it's because, well, at least here in the Philippines, the X-Men were the biggest thing at the time. It was bigger than Spider-Man.
Yeah, oh sure, that makes sense. But Jim Lee as opposed to Chris Claremont or John Byrne or.
Yeah, because it was the Image stuff. So it was all the lead up to the Image stuff.
Okay. Oh, that's very interesting. Okay. So was the Image stuff popular when you were a kid?
Yeah, people still love Spawn to this day.
Well, Spawn and I guess Savage Dragon are still.
Savage Dragon and
200 or more issues.
Yeah, it's both those titles, and they're Spawn just beat Dave Sims' record.
I think
300.
Isn't Dragon up to like 250?
I think really? Dragon is up to 250. Yeah, I think Dragon's up to 250.
But it's interesting because, as talented and brilliant as Eric Larson is, he's not a household name the way Todd McFarlane is.
That is actually interesting to me. Because, wait. So there's so many questions I want to ask now based just on the last 10 minutes. So,
well, I'm happy to do part 2, although, that's up to you. But
happily. We could just keep this going and I could just cut it up.
Okay. Oh, all right. Okay.
So my first question out of all of that is, okay, so let's pretend you were the editor back in the 60s and you had Stan and Jack and Steve on your, had Stan writing and Jack and Steve. And then Stan basically tells you, I'm just going to let these guys do the plotting. I'm just going to tell them what to do. And then they're going to deal with how to pace it and how to lay it out. It's up to them. What would you say to him?
That's it's funny because I have worked, I've never worked with Kirby, but I've worked actually as Stan's editor at a couple of different points, or several different points. And Ditko has drawn a couple of stories I've written. So I have worked with those guys. And my only interaction with Jack Kirby was when I met him and he said to me, "I can tell you're a real firecracker," is what I didn't contradict him. I think my response was something like, I was a little tongue-tied. Um, well, I mean, I kind of get what you're asking. Um, I guess what I would say, you see, this is where this stuff becomes tricky. Because what you're asking me is, I think, should Stan have gotten full writing credit and payment because he didn't fully plot the stories? I think it's kind of what you're asking me. Am I wrong? All right.
Actually, it's more like if if you have a storyteller the caliber of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, wouldn't leaving them alone actually be to your credit?
No.
No. Okay. Okay.
Um, here's the thing, and again, this is totally separate from issues of money and fame. Just talking about what ends up in the pages of a comic that somebody walks into a store and buys. And since you said phrase it back in the 60s, what does somebody walk into a candy store, newsstand, drugstore in 1965? What are they buying? They're buying a comic book that was, okay, here's what we know. We know it was penciled by Jack Kirby. We know it was inked by, let's say, Dick Ayers. We know that Artie Simic did the lettering. We know that Stan Goldberg did the coloring. What did Stan Lee do? Stan Lee was the guy who put the words in the characters' mouths, but he was also the editor, the art director, and the cousin-in-law of the owner of the company. Therefore, what Stan said more or less went, because Kirby and Ditko had relatively few options where else to go to make comparable money, or there were a lot of complicated issues. So Stan was the boss, but he was also a co-creator and collaborator. And what I feel what he did, and I don't think he never plotted. I think he was. I think there were sometimes plot conferences that depend on the era, especially with Kirby. But what Stan could do, and I'm not saying it's right or fair or admirable, but he could say to Jack, this story you've plotted isn't working. Go back and redraw these pages, and I'm going to write my dialogue, and I'm sorry if it contradicts the story, that you thought you were telling, but I have a story to tell that I think readers will enjoy and relate to more. So it's that murky area of collaboration and Stan's multiple hats that he wore. No, I mean, honestly, based on the evidence of the comics done, again, I think Kirby always had somebody scripting, even the Challengers of the Unknown, and I don't know about Captain America, but I think Simon and Kirby had a staff of people working with them. So, again, and again, this is why I wrote a book about it. Other people have written books about it. So I think Stan gave it this certain, although Stan, what everybody knows of Stan is Stan, the Hollywood guy and the rich guy and the famous guy. One thing that I always found, one of the things fascinating about Stan, he lived in a very fancy house with a lot of original art, it was all, he had that Hollywood lifestyle, but the room he worked in was just a plain paneled room with I remember being there in the days of the dot matrix printers. He had like a cardboard box that his printer printed. So, I mean, there was a part of Stan that, as much of a celebrity and as wealthy as he might have become, never lost touch with that poor, struggling kid desperate to get out, of break out of poverty and break out of these kind of the New York, I wouldn't call them slums, but not just a step removed from slums that he grew up in, So I think he never lost touch with the regular person, with the average reader, with what somebody, and I think that goes, and at the same time, he was also writing the cover copy, writing the bullpen bulletins, ballyhooing, uh, uh,
Yeah.
writing the letters column answers, which for me were they felt very personal, even though I knew there were hundreds of thousands of people. So, by the same token, without the imaginations and the talent and the storytelling abilities of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, Stan could not have accomplished that, and not have created this entity that is Marvel, and it's different. I mean, a lot of syndicated cartoonists or tour cartoonists also have assistants or ghosts. I mean, that's part of the whole controversy with Bob Kane and Batman. That's another show.
Yeah.
And
Happy to do a show.
but I
on
mean,
that one.
that's a lot. That's the thing with commercial and collaborative art is who did what, who thought up what. Uh, I mean, that's you see that in every field, whether it's which of the Beatles was the most important. Most readers, most moviegoers, you know, they go to the movies, right? Somebody goes to a Marvel movie or any movie, not any movie, but a lot, many movies people go to forget real world troubles like that and real world conflicts like that. So these are, so back to your question, you know, so if I'm an editor, and boy, this is why editing. I once sat down. I was going on vacation one time. After I'd left Marvel, I worked for a guy named Byron Price at something called Virtual
Yeah.
Comics, where actually I worked with Stan there too, on a project called Rift World. That was a series. That was a series of novels he had overseen that were made into comics, and I don't know how the hell I got to Rift World, but Stan. Um, um, so the question of who, when we talked before about Byrne and Claremont and McFarlane,
Mm-hmm.
these are people who carry outsized weight in a collaboration like Stan did. So yes, in a perfect world, the person who plotted gets X dollars. The person who writes the script gets X other dollars. The person who does the drawings gets, Y dollars. But, if one of the members of that equation is considered one of the selling prospect, the selling elements of the thing, then suddenly they have more weight to throw around. And, so Stan was able to do that, and it worked out to the benefit of readers and filmmakers. Took him a long time to get those movies made. There were 20 or 30 years of him just sort of wandering in exile in Hollywood. Yes. So yes, if you're an editor, okay, here's your money for doing. Here's what you get paid for doing this. Here's what you get paid for doing that. Those were blurred, and they were especially blurred 60 years ago. I mean, if you had said to those guys, in the year 2020, on this thing called the internet, a guy who won't be born for another 25 years is going to be talking to a guy who was 8 years old when you were doing those comics, and they'll be discussing what you did behind closed doors or over the phone. I think even Kirby would say, that's too far out. I can't draw that. That's crazy. Right? I mean, no, they weren't thinking of posterity. They were literally thinking of what their paycheck was going to be at the end of the week, and how much, and what their deadlines were. I don't know how I got to that from your question, but somehow I did.
It's interesting because I think every time, like for me, to try to take away from Stan, Jack, and Steve, it's just like at the end of the day, I find it a little bit. I mean, it was what it was, right? I mean, we saw what they each did without
It
the
was,
other.
yeah,
And the best thing they
yeah,
all did was with each other. So,
right. I think the other part of that equation is Martin Goodman, the guy, the owner of the company, who was Stan's distant cousin.
mhm.
I think Goodman had more of a creative hand, even if it was just by issuing edicts or tell. I mean, I think Goodman was more involved than people know. So I think he was a fourth important element. And oddly enough, of course, he had a long time relationship going back to the '40s with Kirby and Simon. There's all
Oh
that
yeah.
history. Captain America, Kirby, Simon and Kirby. Simon was the first editor at the company, and Kirby was the first art director. Besides them being this famous, comic creating team, and even with Simon and Kirby, nobody knows what Simon did exactly, what Kirby did exactly, and what their staff did exactly. I mean, there's a lot of educated guesses. There's people like Michael Vasallo who have made a lifelong study of it and can give you very educated guesses. But nobody knows but those people, and most of them are dead. But I mean, so this goes back in comics again, unless you have somebody like Will Eisner who did his own writing and drawing, and even he had
Get ghosts.
studio people that would help him. I mean, everybody who worked for him pretty much says that Will was the auteur, and whether or not he specifically did X, Y, or Z, it's as filtered through the Will Eisner consciousness. Stan, of course, was not an artist, so you couldn't it's hard to make the case for Stan as auteur when he's not drawing a single one of the images.
So it's
But it's
safe
hard to
to
make a case. It's hard to make a case for Kirby as the auteur either.
is it safe to say that as out of all of the names we've brought up, with a possible exception of Todd McFarlane, Will Eisner has been the best businessman?
Yeah. He and Todd were that rare combination of people who understood business as well as art. I mean, with Will, the classic thing is because one of his, people always say, and Will certainly made this part of his legend. By the way, full disclosure, I work as a consultant for the Will Eisner Studio and Will Eisner Foundation,
Yeah.
and I'm the chair of Will Eisner Week, which if you don't have it in the Philippines, you should be having it.
You, and you headed a Will Eisner panel at SDCC this year.
Well, that's why, because because I'm always in there pitching on behalf of the Eisner studios and foundation. But anyway, yeah, Will, if you read his own memoir, graphic novels, or read interviews with him, his father was very much a dreamer and an artist, and his mother was more level-headed and practical, and so sort of he's the combination of those two. Yeah, Eisner and McFarlane also. I mean, I think the Image guys in general.
It's really good businessmen.
They knew enough to find good businessmen and lawyers and accountants to represent them. I think they looked and they said, "Oh my God, look how Jack Kirby's being treated." And really, I mean, at a certain point, even look how Stan Lee was wealthy, but he could have been a lot wealthier if he had more of a business sense. He let a lot of things slip through his fingers. So I think they looked at the generation, and I think they also looked at the generation before them, because royalties for comic creators started coming in the '80s, and some of those guys made a lot of money, the X-Men and the Spider-Man.
Yeah.
But some of them, they did what people who come into money do. They bought a lot of cool stuff, but at a certain point, not all of them had heat. So they had bought a lot of cool stuff, but nobody was hiring them anymore. So I think the Image guys looked at that and said, we're not immune to that. We're doing popular culture. The audience is fickle. The editors and the publishers are fickle. We have to protect ourselves, and they set up this business that turned out to be a very smart thing to do. But I think Todd was the guy who had that gleam in his eye to do that and inspired the others.
Yeah, they call him the Todd Father.
That's pretty good. So
getting back to the Stan for one more question a
Sure.
couple more questions about that on Spider-Man. So there are a few myths about how the Spider-Man run ended. I find it personally difficult to believe that Ditko did not know who the Green Goblin was going to be Norman Osborn, since Norman Osborn was in the book. Is that?
I have no idea.
No idea. Okay.
I never, I know Ditko has written a lot, and I think maybe he did even write about that at one point. But if I read it, that was not. I don't,
Is it
that? I mean, if you go back, and Ditko has written voluminous essays in that magazine that he did with Robin Snyder called The Comics.
Yeah.
And I've read a lot of those. And I mean, A, I don't remember exactly what he said about that. And B, even if he did, that's Ditko's point of view and not Stan's, and not necessarily objective truth, but I have no idea. I don't know any better than you.
Is it true that they weren't speaking for like the last 10 issues or so?
That's what I've heard.
Then how did they do the Master Planner saga?
Well, Ditko, you see, this is where this collaboration comes in. Steve brings it in. I think it was Sal Brodsky who was the intermediary.
Okay.
So Ditko brings in the work. I think he did rough pencil layouts, and that's actually where where the Marvel method. That's one version of the Marvel method that came in. And so Stan would see the pages and would script them however he felt best. He used to refer to it like doing a crossword puzzle, that it was kind of a challenge for him to figure out what story Ditko was trying to tell. There's one famous scene that I can't remember exactly, where Stan thought the villain was one figure in the panel and the Spider-Man was the other figure, and he scripted it that way.
Yeah.
And then I think Ditko might have inked it based on Stan's scripting, but he was pissed off about. So, people don't have to love each other to do great work together, apparently. I mean, again, that's true from a lot of music groups. And so it wasn't, I think actually, if you read it carefully, I think Stan was maybe not prepared for the Master Planner being Dr. Octopus. There's not a lot of foreshadowing. Oh, sorry if I gave away a story from 60 years ago. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
But I mean, but you can imagine Ditko getting the pages back to ink after it was lettered, because they used to letter them right on the boards in those days. So imagine Ditko seeing that and going, well, that's not the story I wanted to tell. That's not the subplot. When Peter is angry in that panel, I didn't want him to be angry about that thing. I wanted to be angry about. So, again, this was behind the scenes stuff. I don't get the impression. I think Ditko was maybe a little more ornery. I don't get the impression that Ditko did a lot of redrawing the way I think Kirby, for whatever reasons, felt that if Stan told him to redraw something, he had to. I don't get, especially because he and Ditko weren't speaking. So that's I know it sounds like a crazy way to work, and sort of the light side of that, the more positive side, and why Marvel for years, until maybe 15, 20 years ago, kept working, in a modified version. Marvel's writers worked so-called Marvel method, was because if you got the right artist and writer combination, it really unleashed incredible visual and story potential. Sometimes when you read, when I've written and written things full script, the non-Marvel style, where it's more like a screenplay describing a panel and then the dialogue and captions, it can be very stiff and very confining to an artist. An artist feels like if the writer is telling me what to do in every panel and the editor insists I do what the writer tells me in every panel, then my imagination is wasted.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's subconscious, even if the person wants to do their best work, some artists love it. Some artists thrive knowing exactly what's expected in every panel. But there are some that really find it confining and thrive under the Marvel style, and when it works, those were the best Marvel comics, because you didn't have to explain in a caption and in dialogue what was happening visually. It was clear, and so you could have a characterization in the dialogue instead of exposition.
Yeah.
And again, they didn't have to like each other, but Lee and Kirby and Lee and Ditko had that magic.
It's interesting to me because for me, like those last 10 or so issues when they supposedly weren't speaking to each other, if you remove those 3 issues, to me, it's the weakest part of the run. But then you drop in those 3 issues and it's arguably the peak of the run.
Well, look, it's funny. I was just reading an article today, or I was reading something today about the master planner and the famous scene of Spider-Man,
Yeah.
lifting. And, obviously it's so visual, but Spider-Man's dialogue in those panels is really, that you remember that as much or more as the visuals, the stuff Spidey says, my man, can't give up. I've got, it's easy to, it's easy to, to be optimistic, whatever, maybe you haven't, it's easy to, to be positive, when everything is going your way, but when I'm ruining the whole dialogue, but Stan wrote this.
It's wonderful.
Dialogue. Huh?
It's wonderful.
It's wonderful. And it also paces, the dialogue serves on a pure dollars and cents level as a kid. The more dialogue, the more time you're reading the comic, right? That's but just as in terms of pacing. So instead of your eye going from brilliant image to brilliant image, your time, right? I mean, your time is structured by the words. You have to linger on the image while you're reading those words, and the words amplify the image, and the image amplifies the words. That's the magic of comics, right? You must know. I'm sure you know people. I'm sure people watching know people, really smart people with advanced degrees who can't read comic books.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really, really smart people. So for those of us who can, for whom, for whatever neurological reasons, coordinating the words and the pictures is not, is pleasurable. Something like that. Really, just that's right where the genius of that, the greatness of that partnership comes through. I also think, and this, no one will ever know, obviously. I do think that why, people will say, and I read this literally every day, Stan stole money from Ditko and Kirby because he took their writing money. Well, you know what? Stan was their editor. Stan was the guy who between him and Goodman, gave them whatever their page rate was. And I would find it, again, how do we ever know this? I don't know. It would seem to me that you would give a person a raise based on what they were bringing to the table. And if that included plotting, then, rates were so shitty in those days that maybe $1 or $2 a page was added, and that was supposed to compensate for the plotting. I don't expect anybody in the Kirby camp or the Kirby family or the Ditko camp or family to agree with me, but having been in the editor's chair and worked at the company, I just, it seems to me that would have been a logical thing. A thing that Dick Ayers, if you can find this online, Dick Ayers wrote he was an artist that, inked a lot of Kirby, drew a lot for Marvel and for everybody in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, he died a couple of years ago. Dick did a trilogy, a graphic novel trilogy memoir. And he has one scene where he goes to see Stan, and he'd been drawing Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos. And he comes into Stan. I think Dick had a discussion with his wife, and his wife said, "You plotted that whole story, and you've been plotting, mostly plotting these issues. You go in and you tell Stan, that you should be paid for plotting and get credit too." So at least according to the way Ayers writes it. he goes in to see Stan, and he says, I should get paid for plotting, and I should get credit too. And Stan says, I'll give you more money. I'll increase your page rate, but I won't give you credit. That's really interesting, right? I mean, most people would say, especially if they're not the owner of the company, or whatever, if they're representing the owner of the company, credit is kind of easier to give, right? You just have a letterer write in co-plotted. But Stan's ego, demanded that he not share the plot, and again, not saying that's admirable, but it's very interesting. So at least in terms of the money, now of course you go 60 years later, and I know I get reprint checks when Marvel reprints my stuff, and I get a separate fee for plotting and scripting of stories that they pay me for. So I don't know how they've resolved that with the various families and descendants of the people from the early days. So that's again, that's another issue. But so it seems to me that at least in the moment, that Stan was probably willing to pay to add to the page rates more than he might have if the guys weren't plotting.
That's interesting. There's a pretty famous clip from In Search of Steve Ditko where Stan basically says that he believes whoever came up with the idea is the creator. You know this one?
And you know what? That movie.
Yeah.
I think that's a real hatchet job movie.
Really?
Because, well, here's why.
Okay.
They light Stan as if Wally Wood had drawn him. They got this stark light on one side of his face.
I saw that.
As if he's like a crook that's been brought in for questioning by the cops, right? I mean, they got, and he says this thing that, you know what? He said it a half dozen other times. And yet, the Jonathan Ross I caught Stan in this thing. He said it a half a dozen times on the record. Sorry.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not making a case for Stan as a saint. He was ambitious, ruthless, but and also very generous and affable and kind. He had both. He was a complicated person, but I just hated that people think, oh, he got Stan in that thing. He said it all the time. He believed the guy who came up with the idea is the creator.
He's always been consistent about that too. He was consistent about that from beginning to end. That's what. Yeah.
And it's funny. There's a book that I don't think many people have read because it was a small press. Craig Yo, who, and I encourage you all, after you finish buying all my books, buy Craig Yo's book. Craig publishes a great line of books. But one of them was The Art of Ditko, I think it was called. You familiar with that book?
No, that's not the one I have. I've got The World of Steve Ditko.
Oh, The Art of Ditko.
Okay.
And it's from Craig Yo. Yo book, the imprint, and Stan wrote the forward to it, or at least signed his name to it. I'm assuming he at least saw it, and the introduction says, it's part of a sentence. When Steve Ditko and I created Spider-Man, blah blah blah. And I'm going, whoa! There was none of that. I consider that Ditko got all upset about the word consider, just like when Steve, and it's like nobody ever quotes that. I said, I'm sure it had a small print run, but between you and me, don't tell anybody. If you go to the Amazon site, you can read the introduction without buying it, but you should buy it anyway because it's a great book. But if you want to see that forward that Stan wrote to that book, it's very interesting that without a light shining on half his face and without a guy grilling him, he just said, when Steve Ditko and I created Spider-Man.
I mean, a lot of people think it's just about credit, right? But I mean, even in that documentary, when they frame it as such, when Steve Ditko was looking for credit, it was when the movie was coming out. So there definitely was money involved in trying to get that credit.
You
Right.
know, that I don't know. And I mean, again, Steve's family is working on a documentary and a book about him. A guy named Mark Ditko, he calls himself Mark Zen I think it's Mark, but Mark Zen Ditko. You can
Okay.
find them on the internet. I mean, I think they're trying to set the record straight from their point of view. I don't, you know, you hear all sorts of stories about Ditko and his attitude about money and credit and Stan. And, you know, I don't know, you know, I mean, you know, my favorite debunked myth about Ditko is that he never, you know, he never wanted to speak to anybody and he was a total recluse and he lived alone. Meanwhile, once he died, like 10,000 people came up with, here's a letter Steve Ditko wrote to me, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the guy was a prolific, he was, anybody who wrote to them, he'd respond to, which is kind of like anybody who emailed Stan, he'd respond. You know, so Ditko was not such a mystery in that way. So,
Just didn't do interviews or take photos.
as far as the movie, I mean, I you know, I don't know.
Wait, your mic cut out. Your mic is cutting it.
How about now?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
As far as the movie, I don't. I'm in a rural area, and the internet is wonky sometimes. I'm, you know, you hear different things about deals that Marvel made or tried to make with him, and you know, I mean, you know, you hear about. So I don't know. I mean, certainly
Yeah.
there's that myth that he used his original art as a cutting board, which has been disproven. I think that was just this. You know, people would love to believe all these things about, you know, weird old Steve Ditko. So you know, I don't know where his personal philosophy led him as far as getting money from Marvel, or where Marvel's desire to just make a problem go away, you know, led. So I can't speak to that. So I don't know.
Okay.
You know, it would seem to me that had Steve wanted a payday from Marvel badly enough and had done the thing that people do, which is get lawyers involved, that they would have made some accommodation. But I don't know. I mean, I'm just guessing. Maybe somebody
Probably
knows better.
just me as a fan reading too much into it. So
Yeah, look, Stan. Look, don't forget what Stan did was he never gave up his day job.
that's true. Yeah.
I mean, he made sure. I mean, he was, you know, in good times and bad times, he was a corporate media executive with a lot of what that entailed. You know, and I guess maybe the last 10 years or more, it was mostly ceremonial, and you go around to conventions and kind of, you know, represent Marvel and also represent his own company, that Power Entertainment, the last 15 years or so. But he never, you know, he had that image in his mind of his father's chronic unemployment and underemployment and living in poverty. And he never, I mean, that was always the thing, no matter who, you know, because anytime a new owner would buy Marvel, you know, the first thing they would say is, why are we paying this guy Stan Lee all this money? You know, we have the characters. He's not writing many comics. You know, it's nice that he goes to conventions and people, you know, find him adorable. But why are we? And you know, Stan's family and the people and you know, his colleagues at his companies, he was very well protected. You know, but he never gave up that day job, because I think he realized, maybe just by seeing what happened to guys like Kirby, like, oh boy, without that, you know, even though, you know, there's no such thing as a job that, you know, I mean, as we've learned in the past few months, just having a job doesn't mean you keep that job. But, you know, Stan understood staying connected to a company, and not fully taking the leap into being a freelance guy. So that, you know, that was another aspect of him that, you know, was sort of interesting and different, you know, different than what Kirby and Ditko did. You know, they had more freedom, but they, you know, with less of a sort of guaranteed, you know, baseline, or way more than baseline income.
It seemed to me that Steve was happy with how things ended up for him. based on this his output at the end of his life. Like he
Yeah.
seemed to be doing what he wanted to do.
Yes, Steve, and again, I only met him once or twice, and they were very pleasant. And I certainly was, thrilled that he drew a couple of stories that I wrote. Um, but yeah, he didn't seem like somebody who was highly materialistic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and but I will say that part of my book. What book is that? Why, that's A Marvelous Life, the
Yeah.
amazing story of Stan Lee. Available. Not only is it available in hardcover, the paperback is coming out September 1st, and there's an audio book that I myself read.
Oh
So
wow.
if you think hearing this is great, just wait till you get the audio book. Uh, so the and of course plugging that I lost my
Which to everyone listening, I'm gonna put Amazon links at the bottom of this video
thank
to
you.
those
Okay.
books. Yeah.
So what? How did I get
Uh,
the book?
it's just that Ditko was happy at the end of his life.
So Ditko. I mean, one thing that I think I my book is in some ways about the love story, the love-hate story between Stan and Jack and Stan and Steve. Because when I mean, Kirby, you read the interviews, listen to the interviews with him, and certainly they evidence ambivalence, that, at times veering into hate or resentment. Ditko's essays, because he didn't do any interviews, but Ditko's essays, so he's in control, he's writing them, read to me like somebody very disappointed in a friend, or even, I mean, they weren't lovers, obviously, but somebody who loved, two guys who loved each other, and one of them really felt let down. There were certain of those monster stories, those fantasy stories, that Stan only would, he said, I'm saving this for Ditko. It took all of, every Amazing Fantasy before Spider-Man, every story was Lee and Ditko, Lee and Ditko. There's a short story of the two of them in the office arguing. There's how Stan and Steve create Spider-Man, that featurette from the first Amazing Annual.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Ditko would have drawn it or been party to it if he didn't somehow feel that he really liked Stan. And then somewhere in there, Stan, he felt betrayed or let down by Stan. And then anything he wrote about, because he's not writing it, to me anyway, seems in my interpretation of Ditko's writings, is he's not writing about a business partner who like screwed him out of money, or a creative partner who took more credit. He's really writing like his best friend stabbed him in the back. I mean, I just feel like there was this connection, and I think in a way that I don't think Stan and Jack felt, because there was all that sort of weirdness that went on in the 40s when
Yeah.
Simon and Kirby were running the joint and Stan was their assistant, and then Goodman was screwing them out of money, so they started doing work for DC. And Stan found out about it, and Kirby supposedly always thought that Stan had ratted them out to Goodman. Simon didn't feel that way, and Stan claims he never did. But I mean, comics is, as you may have figured out, a kind of small gossipy business. So if these guys are going moonlighting at DC, I mean, wasn't going to stay secret very long.
No.
But I mean, but Kirby supposedly had hard feelings stemming from that. But so I think it was impossible for him to ever feel really like Stan was his friend. I think the Kirbys and the Lees might have had dinner occasionally, but that felt like it was more of a business thing, And again, I've read things that Joe and Lee have said in interviews, Stan's wife, that made it sound like a little more than that. I guess they all lived on Long Island, so maybe there were times they spent socially. But
Mm-hmm.
there's something about what Ditko writes about Stan that feels to me like profoundly hurt in a way that you wouldn't feel hurt by some guy who just happened to be in business with you.
One more question about Spider-Man from that era,
Sure.
and then we can get back to the 90s. Amazing Fantasy was a title that was known for, having twist endings.
Right.
Therefore, do you think Spider-Man would have had the origin he had if he didn't debut in Amazing Fantasy, where the twist ending was that the burglar was the one who killed?
That's a good question. That's a really good question, and I have absolutely no idea. Did any of the other Marvel origins have twist endings like that?
No, I don't think so.
Huh. You know, that's it. Maybe look, maybe Steve contributed that, or maybe just don't forget there's a synergy when when two people work together and are talking about a story, which I think Stan and Steve did quite a bit, at least when they were talking.
Yeah.
You know?
It's so funny. It's so funny with comics. You get a lot of stories about people who just stop talking to each other, and
well, I think because they're people. I think they're similar things. You have people who are passionate about what they do. These characters take on a life of their own, and you have two people kind of trying to steer the ship at the same time. But comics does have. I think look, life does, and I think certainly any art form does, where it's almost, I guess at a certain point you can't talk to that there's no reasoning with the other person because they see whatever it is so rigidly from their point of view, and the only recourse is to not talk to them. I mean, I feel like there were relatively few people in my comics career, which stretches back like 40 plus years now, that I think there's few people that I won't talk to, or on the other hand won't talk to me. But I can you can see how it happens, because this it's a thing, and I think that ties in with the Stan and Steve and Spider-Man, because let's face it, I mean, even though I think Stan did, look, and there's this really strange thing happened in the 90s when Stan wanted to do what eventually became the Marvel 2099 line, but Stan wanted to do this story, a graphic novel that would eventually become Ravage.
Yeah.
That he did with Paul Ryan and Danny Fingeroth. But Steve came in for a meeting with Stan. Stan was in town. I don't know if he came in especially for whatever it was. Came to New York, and Steve came in, and they had a meeting. I think they went to lunch. They came back. I mean, I think I saw. Apparently, I was in the office then, but I guess I saw the afternoon part of the meeting after they'd come back from lunch. And I honestly don't know if they had lunch together, or if they broke for lunch and then reconvened. But I remember saw Stan's face as Ditko walked in the room, and his face lit up like seeing a long lost relative or best friend. And Ditko came in, took the meeting. Obviously they ended up not doing the project, and then I think starting around that time is when Ditko's started writing a lot of negative stuff about Stan. But even Steve, so I mean, we say people weren't talking. He came in for the meeting, and I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
I think he had enough work that he didn't have to come in just because he needed that work. I don't think that was the issue. There must have been something intriguing to him for whatever reason about coming in to see Stan.
That's interesting. That's a story that I don't think I've ever heard anywhere. So
in here.
It's in Stanley, A Marvelous Life, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my argument for Stan has always been, Kirby and Ditko might have done a bunch of the plotting, but out of all of the hats Stan wears, even if you took that out, which you can't because he still did some of the plotting, even if you took that out, there's still everything else he did.
Mm-hmm. Well, nobody ever argues that Stan kind of put Marvel on the map as a marketing guy and an editor. Where the conflict comes in is the actual stories and characters. And but that's they're you can't separate them. They're so interrelated.
Yeah. Like I say, like Spider-Man to me, like I think of Ditko, and Thor and Fantastic Four, I think of Kirby. But if I think of Marvel as a whole line, I think of Stan.
Well, that's and it's a fascinating thing, because even Walt Disney. I mean, I don't think there's a comparable Walt Disney, I don't know, Chaplin. I mean, who you know, I mean, it's a very weird, you know, people know, obviously they know the Disney company, and most people know the image of Walt Disney's face. And maybe depending on your generation, you might have, you know, seen the Walt Disney show that was on Sunday nights. But I don't know if there's any real sense of Walt Disney as even as even a fictional person or a corporate person, you know, a corporate symbol that you would know the way, you know, those cameos really raise Stan's visibility in a way that, you know, I mean, Hitchcock did cameos, but you really weren't supposed to see them. And, you know, I don't know if there's anybody, you know, that's why I said you have to maybe go back to Chaplin, who wrote and directed, but Stan didn't write and direct, you know, the film. He wasn't the star. He just was this guy who showed up, you know, and somehow everybody knew that he was Stan. It's
I want to talk about Maximum Carnage.
yeah, not the clone. Okay, Maximum Carnage.
We'll get to that one.
Okay.